Welcome back to the podcast. Did you know for about the first 200 years of Jewish life in America, until about the mid 1800s, there were absolutely zero rabbis in the Jewish community? Did you also know that most American Jews were not Zionists until after World War I? And that many Jews in Europe referred to America in its first couple hundred years as both the Treifa Medina, the country that is unkosher, and the Goldene Medina, the country made out of gold. We discuss any and all of these issues in American Jewish history and then look to the future. What is the future of American Judaism? What might happen to the percentage of Jews who are becoming anti-Zionist in the American Jewish community? What do we make of and what explains the success and ubiquity of Kabad? And we discuss much, much more with American Jewish Studies professor Zev Eleff, who is one of the most prolific researchers and writers in the topic. Feel free to like and subscribe. And now I bring you Zev Eleff. Welcome back to the podcast. Zev Eleff is the president of Gratz College and a widely renowned speaker, writer, and professor on American Jewish history. Zev, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, and thanks to my mom for providing that introduction.
I love that. So I wanted to pick your thoughts on all things, both American Jewish history, and then I think it'll naturally segue into the current moment of American Judaism that we find ourselves. So let's start, way back when. There's always been this sense that I've had, and I think the history backs up this sense, that Judaism in America just started off fundamentally different than, say, the European or Middle Eastern counterparts in the Jewish community. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. But if we're going to roll the clock all the way to the beginning, I think one of the most stunning things that you get that people are continuously shocked to hear is for the first couple hundred years of Jewish life in America, there simply were not any rabbis. So talk to us about that. How do you have Jewish community without rabbis?
Can you imagine that? From when 23 Jews disembark in 1654 from the St. Catherine until 1840 with the arrival of Rabbi Abraham Rice to America. It's almost 200 years without a rabbi. And yet, the Jewish community, not very good for rabbinical seminaries to know this fact. The American Jewish community only grew without a rabbinic presence and leadership. I think you're right, although I think scholars of all different communities will claim, oh, ours is different. The thing that I study is so important. When it comes to American Judaism and the idea of the New World, this was an exciting opportunity, not just for Jews, but for all people. The Puritans were the first instance of people looking for this antinomian culture of moving from where they were oppressed into a place where they thought they could flourish, for example. So that theme of America is very important for a lot of different people. It's absolutely the case that when one goes on a tour of Jewish sites in America versus, say, in Europe, the ones that take those tours in America are not alerted to, well, a pogrom took place here. And this was when this horrible atrocity took place, where it took place. And in America, therefore, offers that fresh lens. Not to say at all that anti-Semitism is a new phenomenon in the United States. But the real challenge to my mind about the American Jewish experience has been how to scaffold, how to build an American Judaism. Think about it this way, although some rabbis like to speak about Minhag Philadelphia or Minhag Portland, Oregon. Not many do. In general, communities here have not established their own geographic folkway, is a really good example. Polish, German, Sephardic, North African minhagim customs have migrated to the United States. And in that way, American Jews of all types have tried to figure out how to bring those old world ideas and behaviors and those rituals and how to synergize them with America. So what I mean by all this is that they've had to deal with a tabula rasa, a new environment, but never start brand new and fresh. To the contrary, figure out how to bring the old and the new together.
It also seems like there was somewhat of a selection bias of who got here and we're talking before 1880s, obviously, then it very much switches in terms of who immigrated here. We can talk about that in a few minutes. But if you were a early Sephardic Jew in the 16 or 1700s, or a German Jew in the early 1800s, you were probably coming here specifically because you wanted some, Puritan idea of a fresh start, or you were coming because you thought you can strike it rich here. I mean, push back if you disagree with this historic classification. How much of this, in terms of the equality, that Jews have generally experienced in America compared to places like Europe, is just because of early capitalism in America? Meaning there was there's a famous letter, you'll probably remember the name, I'm completely forgetting, where very early on, I think this was even before the United States was founded, where the Christian guy wanted to have different laws for Jews. I believe this is in, early 1700s. And he sends a letter back to Europe, and they say, no, sorry, anyone's allowed to do business with anybody in America. And it's sort of
Peter
just that.
Stuyvesant, the governor of New Amsterdam. This is already in 1655.
Okay, so
Who
a lot
finds that
earlier.
there's a surge of Jews, and he asks the West, I think that's what you're talking about, the West India Company, about, hey, can we do things differently and maybe not have them here at all? And they say, no, we have this idea of toleration among the Dutch, and Stuyvesant is defeated, not completely. That is always the first instance of, although it's an anachronism, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish violence against the Jewish community. I think you're right. I'm not going to push back, but I'm going to refine just a little bit. The Jews of the Sephardic diaspora, remember, much has changed because of the Inquisition. You can actually, and my beloved teacher Jonathan Sarna does this in his American Judaism, begins not with 1654 with the arrival of Jews, but actually with the Inquisition. The Inquisition, particularly in Brazil, it's controlled by the Dutch and then the Portuguese. People always blame Spain in 1492, but in 1497, Portugal adopted the Inquisition. In 1653, when Portugal invades, and that's what they speak now to this day, so you can tell who won, invades Brazil, that's when the Inquisition enters the Western Hemisphere. So it's a very live thing in the 17th century. The Jews of the Sephardic diaspora, who are in a diaspora because of the Inquisition, have developed through the West India Company, through, as you point out, through economic opportunity, a cycle and a circle of trade. The concept of port Jews, again, to borrow from Jonathan Sarna, that it's Jews are not producing materials, they are trading materials. And so if I am starting a business in London, importing and exporting sugar, sometimes we have to be honest about it, slaves as well. I want to utilize a port, say in Newport, Rhode Island, or Charleston, South Carolina, or the Caribbean. I am going to look for a trusted partner, and I am therefore going to incentivize my nephew, my son. Usually it's a man's business at that time. And so that's how the Sephardic diaspora lands along the eastern seaboard of colonial America. In economics, you're absolutely correct. Play a pivotal role in the second wave of migration in the 19th century, with the so-called German migration. There was no Germany yet, but that's how they referred to themselves. And they are looking for opportunity. Usually it's young men, unmarried, sometimes married. If they're married, they come by themselves. What's critically important is Landsmannschaft, is the idea that I'm from Eisenstadt. I've started to peddle oranges in Cleveland, in Albany, New York, and I will write a letter to my landsmen, literally the people from my community, Eisenstadt, and I will encourage my neighbor to come as well. Now, these people therefore are not as wealthy as the well-scaffolded Sephardic, Spanish, Portuguese community of the early colonial period. But what I think people misunderstand, they're not poor. Because if you're poor, you can't make it to America. It costs the equivalent sometimes between 10 and 20,000 of today's dollars to make it to the United States. So they're saving a great deal. Sometimes they only have half the funds, and so they start peddling oranges in London. They make it to England, and they work for a couple of years. I think all of a sudden I'm thinking about the biblical Jacob and working over and over again. And only then do they make it to the United States. But the totally impoverished Jew can't make it to the United States. They when they make it to America, they're dirt poor because they spent it all in transportation.
And of course, because there are no rabbis and there was very little religious infrastructure here, the Orthodox establishment, or what would eventually become the Orthodox establishment, was telling people not to come. I mean, they called it, the non-kosher land, the Treifa Medina. I mean, that might be a little bit later, but it seems like that's what I was talking before with the selection bias, where if you
Yes.
were, a 25-year-old unmarried man who was making the decision to, hop on a boat and end up, wherever in America, you can
Right.
probably imagine that person was not the most religious, because if they were, they probably would have stayed in Europe.
Right. So Arthur Hertzberg wrote the very important article balancing the so-called Golden Medina. You don't really know much Yiddish, you know what that means. The Golden State versus the Treifa Medina, again, the Treif or non-kosher state. Those are terms that enter the lexicon, as you point out, much later in the 19th century. I've dated, we were talking before about my first book, Who Rules the Synagogue. I've dated it to the Civil War. You look at the German writings of, say, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, he's actually very much in favor of people migrating, particularly after the Hep riots, after there seems like Jewish life and anti-Semitism, again, an anachronism at that time, has really received an uptick in the failed riots, European riots of the late 1840s and 1850s. He encourages migration to America. It's the Civil War in the backwardness of America. Remember, already right before the Civil War, the Russians have freed the serfs. How could America be so backward and socially uh, unbecoming? How could it be that religions, Southern and Northern Baptists, are being torn asunder? Uh, why can't they figure it out? And so it's really the Civil War for a lot of people, including Jews, that convinces the most pious that maybe America's not for our people.
So one of the very common denominators of, you talk to rabbis, it doesn't matter, which denomination, it doesn't even matter if they're not working in synagogue life today, is a relationship between donors and the board and rabbis in terms of contracts. When rabbis started showing up here in the mid 1800s, this was not a seamless, oh great, now we have a rabbi, we can sort of offload stuff to them, to the point where there's even some, famous or infamous episodes of actually, fights happening and, on the Bima. Talk to us a little bit about that. What, first let's go before, 1840s, 1850s. How would synagogues have been, I mean, especially for I guess I'll put my cards on the table, for non-Orthodox communities today, essentially a rabbi almost does everything. And so, I understand in an Orthodox Minion and a shtibel, when anybody can get up and be the chazan and anybody can give a speech on the parsha, fine. But in your average Reform synagogue today, if there are weeks that the rabbi isn't there, sometimes services won't even happen. And there's this idea, one of my favorite things to tell college students is you don't actually need a rabbi for anything. They find it the most hilarious idea in Judaism. And they're like, well, what about a wedding? And I'm like, no, you don't, it doesn't say anywhere you need a rabbi to officiate.
We don't have a Eucharist, right?
Yeah, exactly. But very much, and it's always non-Orthodox Jews that are more surprised to hear that. Orthodox Jews are like, oh, of course you don't need a rabbi. The rabbi is the person that probably knows more if you have a halachic question. And so what were the communities like? And then talk to us about this friction that ended up
And
blowing up in the
that may
1800s.
be the most persistent legacy of Isaac Mayer Wise of, hey, you need a rabbi now. You're absolutely right. Is that first of all, on any ritual basis, you do not need a rabbi to bless the food, to recite the ritual. And like we talked about, how there for nearly 200 years, it's much smaller community, probably around 1,000 Jews for just for perspective's sake, around the revolution, maybe
Just
2,000.
don't tell that to the people who pay my salary. That for them, you need them to bless the food,
Yeah,
and for the. So,
I think with the podcast, you're sabotaging that. The uh, Going back to migration, it's interesting how pivotal migration is coming in this conversation. Is the folks who moved uh, to the Americas and then the United States were from smaller towns. Uh, those places also do not have rabbis. They had religious functionaries. They had crackerjack, usually unordained men who knew how to do ritual slaughter. They knew how to perform a circumcision. They could hack it when it came to a marriage ceremony. But they were not what we call Talmidei Chachamim. They were not scholars by any stretch. They knew how to do it. They're crackerjacks, and that culture empowered in Europe lay leaders. And so when those folks and their children move to the United States, they're not anxious to obtain the services and pay rabbis. When they did, they paid them usually 1 year contracts, 2 year contracts at the most. Not very well. They had to have part-time jobs. Story I like to tell is when Morris Raphael, who was the rabbi of what's now known as, oh, well, then still known as B'nai Jeshurun, BJ, on the Upper West Side, he was really their first rabbinic leader. He came early. He came around Passover time, and the congregation told him, "We're not ready to pay your salary. Come back at Rosh Hashanah." And he went on tour to speaking to the first scholar in residence in American Jewish history. Um, that's changed with Isaac Mayer Wise, the architect of American Reform Judaism, who's also the first person to receive tenure, a lifetime contract when he moves from Albany and Cincinnati. You're correct when you allude to that. He's the one who got into a fight on Rosh Hashanah. He was fired before for espousing what people deemed to be heretical views. Louis Spanier, who was the lay leader in Albany at the time, blocks Wise from receiving the honor of Peticha, of opening up the curtain of the Ark before taking out the Torah scrolls on Rosh Hashanah. And they got into a fight. Such a fight, such a melee, as the newspaper described it at the time, that Wise was handcuffed by the constable, by police, and he and his people held second day of Rosh Hashanah services. I guess he was let out of prison in his living room. He starts another congregation in Albany, but then he receives a lifetime contract from a group of Jews, wealthier Jews, in Cincinnati. They give him a lifetime contract, which resets, like a football analogy, to reset the market on rabbis. And all of a sudden, though, with certain changes and liberties, and now rabbis, when you have a lifetime contract or a 5-year contract even, all of a sudden rabbis are able to exercise certain liberties. And not that pay rabbi more, he'll reform the congregation. That's not what I mean. But they'll take certain liberties in how they introduce sermons, editing the prayer book, as Wise does in 1856 and 1857. And when rabbis take control, implicitly or explicitly, and it really depends on the rabbi, it's in all professions, of course, what we find is that rabbis manage to loosen the grip of lay leaders on the synagogue in terms of ritual and expectations, and so much so that eventually lay leaders who are not well educated at that time, much better educated today. We think about it in the reverse. We're always screaming about the lack of Jewish education, but actually it's much better than it was in the early 19th century. What happens is that lay leaders gain less of a foothold in the day-to-day Judaism, and all of a sudden you need rabbis.
Yeah, I like how you put that we're always sort of looking to the past and saying, oh, it was so much better. I think the other way in which I see this, and where I wanted to sort of move to the next question, is this idea that always throughout Jewish history and American Jewish history, the synagogues were packed, and what is happening now that the synagogues are empty? I mean, I think this is also in Jonathan Sarna's book. He kind of goes through different statistics of what percentage of Jews had any relationship with the synagogue. So this is even showing up in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they are tiny percentage. I mean, I'm not going to, pretend to have remembered them, but, it seems like when people talk about this idea that, synagogues were once packed, they're talking about sort of one snapshot in history in the mid 20th century. But if we did go back in a time machine to the mid to late 1800s, synagogues
or a particular synagogue, right? If one looked only at Park Avenue or Central Synagogue, that doesn't really betoken the current climate today.
Sure, no, but this idea that, I mean, obviously Jews weren't yet really in the suburbs, but this idea that, and in every suburb, I mean, Orange County is a funny place. I live in, Irvine, California. Within walking distance of where we live, there are 3 synagogues within, 5 minutes, a Reconstructionist, Reform, and Modern Orthodox. And if we venture out, another couple of miles, there's a couple conservative, a couple more reform, a bunch of Chabad sprinkled around. And especially in the non-Chabads, I think Chabad is a totally different phenomenon, which, I want to ask you about in a little bit, because I think it is, one of the defining stories of the last, 20, 30 years of American Jewish life.
Yeah.
But especially for non-Orthodox synagogues, one of the stunning things that you get whenever you go there is this sense, both from, pictures on the wall and for talking to many of the congregants who tend to be older, of, we don't get it. When we were in Hebrew school, circa 50, 60 years ago, things were packed and, there were 40 people in my graduating Hebrew school class. And now, many suburban non-Orthodox synagogues seem to have declining membership. And in my mind, I've always seen this as just a reversion to the mean, whereas in their mind, this is the first time in history that people are uninterested in synagogues. So I would love to get your thoughts on that.
So I think you're right on the whole. The synagogue was was the headquarters of Jewish life, certainly in the colonial period. The synagogue was where you obtained your kosher food. It is being a member of the synagogue allowed you to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, or at least a Jewish plot area in a larger cemetery. You couldn't do Jewish without the synagogue. Eventually, with heterodoxy, with disengagement from the synagogue, people in America learned, and elsewhere too, but it'll focus on America, learned how to do Judaism outside of the synagogue. Literary societies, what we call today JCCs, but YMHAs, Young Men Hebrew Associations, the American Jewish Historical Society, Jewish Publication Society, all of a sudden in the late 19th century produced books. Not that different than reading blog posts or listening to podcasts to this day. In some ways, you in this podcast is competing in the marketplace for Jewish content. No longer, certainly in the last 20 years, as we try to contemporize this conversation, do Jews need to consume? Because we're really talking about consumption here, a market. You don't need to wait for the rabbinic sermon on a Saturday morning to obtain your quotient of Jewish sustenance. It's just not so. In every epoch, every generation, there are that marketplace becomes more and more crowded. I think it's poignant now because of our digital age, how people consume it. But there were always rivals. That Mordecai Kaplan, although he didn't, Henry Berkowitz likely did, created the most well-known Jewish center, the Jewish Center in Manhattan, in in the 1910s. He was also riffing and challenging the emergence of the Jewish Community Center, JCC. He's deliberately saying, "Hey, you don't need a JCC to do this. You can do it at a Jewish center, at a synagogue." So there's always been this marketplace for American Judaism, for Jewish culture, even Jewish religion. How the synagogue competes and what it's offered, the so-called shul with the pool, the men's club, the bingo tournament. All this stuff is how synagogues have tried to develop the repertoire to compete in the marketplace for the attention of American Jews.
I love this idea of, sort of free market Judaism. I think it also speaks to, I'll sort of start at the end and then we can work our way back. Jews that aren't living in America, so whether we're talking about, Sephardic / Mizrahi Jews, or you pop into Israel, or even you go visit, Jewish communities in Europe, they're sort of shocked at the number of different Jewish institutions. And I'm not even necessarily talking about denominations, just the fact that in any city you can have about 30 different Jewish experiences, especially today. That, I mean, it's starting to come to Israel. We can probably trace some American influence on that, but that's sort of, a tangent that we don't have to go down. But talk to us about, so it seems like because of this idea of rabbi salaries are not paid by the government, right? There's no chief rabbi of America, despite, some attempts to try in the 1800s, right? And no, there is a separation of church and state to the point where everything is bottom up in a way that it just couldn't be bottom up in places like France and England and Germany for a whole variety of reasons. You have this wide array of Jewish options and Jewish denominations. Would you say that, because obviously the denominations, started in Germany, but then quickly, migrated here. Would you say that denominationalism is sort of a unique American Jewish phenomenon?
It isn't and isn't. You're absolutely right. You had the Stadt Rabbiner, you had the state-sponsored rabbi. Uh, Many rabbis come to the United States because The communities blocked them. This is David Einhorn, for example, the radical reform rabbi, or even Abraham Rice likely came here because all of a sudden there was new legislation that a rabbi needed to have a college degree in. Rice didn't have one. So there are less restrictions on who is a rabbi in the United States. Denominations, though, in America are different than in Europe. In Europe, they are much more rigid. As you point out, Christian denominations, think about Luther and the like, they start with much agitation. Many Protestant denominations, I'm thinking Quakers, for example, come to the United States for refuge because they are not seen as part of a larger world, European Protestantism. Not really the case, though, in America. In America, denominations are understood in the way that back in the day, you would go to the bank and you would ask to take out $100, and the teller would inquire, in what denomination would you like that? This is the idea of the great scholar of religion, Sidney Mead. What that question means is, do you want two $50 bills, 10 $10 bills, 5 20? I know arithmetic. And there is no quantifiable difference. If I pay for an item with two $50 bills versus $101 bills, or even a huge amount of pennies, though I think a store owner would not like that. It's all the same amount. That's the way that American denominationalism works in the Christian world, in the Protestant world, rather. There are many different denominations, many different pathways to get to heaven. Some like the scenic route, some like the intellectual route, some like to be baptized twice. But American Protestantism fundamentally understands that I like my pathway, but these are all pathways to heaven. Catholicism is an exception. Those are two sects, although maybe not any longer. But maybe yes. American Judaism begins in that fashion. But if you think particularly about issues of conversion, of who is qualified to officiate in a marriage, American Judaism does not operate that way. Conservative and Orthodox Judaism historically have not accepted Reform converts, for example. They'll ask for yet another conversion. Israel and the role of the chief rabbin in determining who has status, right? Think about the 1950 law of return. Of a Jew who is qualified, a Jew can migrate, no questions asked, to Israel and have safe harbor. Well, who counts as a Jew? What if you're converted by a Reform rabbi in the United States? Do you have that same status for the law of return? So denominationalism in the Christian context and then eventually in the Jewish context, they part ways. What's happening now is really interesting. And many people have made much ado over post-denominational Judaism. I think that's really, I was probably tentative in my agreement with that, but I think post-COVID, in post-COVID, and you had anticipated some of this, so maybe I'll bring it to the fore right now. We're all living in a Chabad world. We're all living in a you do you. We may not let you marry our daughters, but come as you are, wear what you need to wear, and we'll accept you as much as we possibly can. And that's not just in non-Orthodox circles. I think we're seeing that much more in Orthodox circles too. Some of these great debates regarding gender, and I don't mean from a halachic consideration, but we are demanding less. We are blacklisting fewer people, which is actually not post-denominationalism. It is with some significant hesitation, or maybe it's a don't ask, don't tell policy, who knows. We are reverting back to Sidney Mead's understanding of denominationalism. Multiple pathways to get to heaven. I'm not necessarily advocating, this is my analysis. I'm not a stakeholder in this.
No, of course. No, I think this is really fascinating because I think you're right that even Orthodoxy has become much more Kiruv centric. I mean, maybe it's different if you're in an Orthodox stronghold. So maybe if we were in, Teaneck, the conversation would be a little bit different. But, the three cities I've lived in America in my life, and I lived in Jerusalem for years, but San Diego, Los Angeles, and Irvine, California. So this is, West Coast Jewry, very
Yep.
different than East Coast. I've always been a part of the local Orthodox community, and there is a tinge of kiruvness, right? So the Orthodox shul I grew up in San Diego and the Orthodox shul that I'm involved with right now in Irvine, the number of people who are balei teshuva or on some path to, they drive to synagogue, but they still, very much the Chabad model of, people that are not halachically observant, yet, they find the community warm. There's a lot of people who come to the community through conversion, and that just seems like it's unique. And if we roll back the clock 50 years ago, not to say there weren't any converts to, Orthodox
There were
Judaism.
more boundaries. There were certainly more boundaries. I mean, think about where you've been and where I've been, and take, for example, the community that has, say, a partnership minion, right, which allows much more inclusion of women leadership and in the ritual. But it's certainly not orthodox, and it's probably not going to cut muster with your typical conservative congregation. So very often, those partnership minyanim will meet once a month, twice a month. What's interesting, what happens when the people who belong to that partnership minion, they have an off Shabbos. Where do they attend synagogue? Some will go to the Orthodox synagogue, no questions asked. Some will go to Chabad. Some will go to the conservative synagogue. The porousness of that is really, really interesting. And it's not as if I have never heard a case in which there are gatekeepers that, you attended the partnership minion, you're not allowed into Orthodox synagogue this week. I don't know if that would have taken place in the 1970s, 1960s. But the fact is that there is that elasticity, nimbleness in the religious marketplace of American Judaism.
Okay, so you mentioned that we're all in a Chabad world. For people that heard that and that's sort of lingering, and they're like, "What the heck are you talking about?" What do
Yeah.
you mean? What do you mean by we're all in a Chabad world?
So Chabad. And I have to say that the most humbling thing about my familial status is that no matter how many, you were very kind about referring to my books and my articles, nothing more humbling than your first cousin being Dan's deals. Daniel Eleff, who is a member of the Chabad community, as are my other cousins and my aunt and uncle. Um, so Chabad. Uh, Chabad Chabad is inherently post-denominational. Are they a part of the Orthodox community? I don't mean about the Messianism. That's for somebody else to talk about. But the accepting, the power of acceptance of the Chabad community, of taking Jews at full depth, having programming that complements synagogue life, but have nothing to do with it. Certain culture of drinking, I think I'm embracing that. Think about the Chabad Robinson that I, not so tongue-in-cheek, referred to as the most powerful person in American Judaism. The Chabad playbook, there's no actual playbook to my understanding, but the sense about it is the investment that goes into the Chabad Robinson. Always very presentable in public, will purchase a very expensive shaitel, a head, a wig. Will always is almost trained to be this very charming, personable figure, a partner with her husband in everything but rabbinic title. Very often will lead the early childhood program, which is the gateway for many into the Chabad synagogue and the Chabad community. And again, much more approachable than the scraggly, bearded husband, very often. I know very fine Chabad shluchim. I don't
Yeah.
mean to put anybody. We have created models in all sectors of American Jewish life that's based on the success. A couple of examples. JLIC on campus. The OU initiative empowers a husband and wife to be the Orthodox leaders on campus. Another good example, the reinvigoration of early childhood into synagogue spaces. It never left, but Chabad really showed a new model. A very important example, understudied, although Jack Wertheimer in his new book on Jewish giving makes reference to it, the philanthropic playbook of how to fundraise. locally, not nationally, from certain people with disposable income. Chabad as a network and how to create hub and spoke models. That's why I say, not so jokingly, that it's a Chabad world and we're just living it.
Your depiction of the Rebbitin, I want to hone into that a little bit because you were sort of, a little bit tongue in cheek, but mostly not. I was talking to somebody that's relatively high up in Chabad. I won't say his name, but he was one of the Rebbes, right hand men when the Rebbe was still alive, and he's been very instrumental in helping roll out Chabad, especially to West Coast communities. And I remember he said once, and again, I think he also said this kind of somewhat tongue in cheek, but also with a deep seriousness. He said, why Chabad is winning because a young rabbi shows up with, a beautiful wife and, all of the, young guy, he's talking about campus. So all the guys are looking at this Chabad rabbi and thinking, how can I be like this guy to have a beautiful wife and a beautiful family, and everything there. I love this idea of sort of, Chabad is a post-denominational community. I've always, made this distinction. And, I've worked for Hillel for years, and Hillel is very proud to be pluralistic. And I've been playing around with this idea for years that Chabad is inclusive, Hillel is pluralistic in terms of that differentiation. So I wanted to run that by you to see if you think that makes sense. In my mind, inclusivity, at least how I'm defining it with Chabad, means no questions asked on how you enter the door. And so, Chabad does not care, obviously, if you drive to synagogue. Chabad doesn't even care if you're dating a non-Jewish girl. Chabad doesn't care if you've just come from the anti-Zionist, rally on campus and you're wearing a keffiyeh.
With maybe that might be one point, but you would know better than I would.
Sure. Now, once you get in the door, right, that's when Chabad is not pluralistic. So Chabad will never hand the Kiddush cup over to the, to really
And they
any
won't let you date their daughter.
Exactly. And they won't let you date your daughter. Whereas Hillel, tries to have the same inclusivity, right? Again, again, some asterisks around the Israel part, which I think is sort of a unique last couple of years. But the idea is that, who Hillel ends up, once you're in the door, Hillel then allows for a wide array of opportunity, in keeping with this free market idea. I think for a lot of reasons, and you don't have to necessarily weigh in on that, that is sort of not winning in the marketplace of ideas because I think people want, more content driven than, I don't know, you be the master of your own destination. This is sort of another sort of meta debate that I've been having with my Hillel colleagues. So, I don't need to drag you into this, but I think it is really interesting. I mean, if you had to pinpoint why Chabad now, I mean, because for people that aren't familiar with American Jewish history or even Jewish denominations, they don't understand how crazy this is, that Chabad is virtually not taking over, but, competing on every space, right? There's now Chabad teen programs, there's Chabad summer camps, there's Chabad on campus, there's, every reform and conservative suburban synagogue has a Chabad that's open within 2 miles of it, right? Like, Chabad is so ubiquitous and so successful. If you would have told somebody 40 years ago that that would be the case, I assume you would have been laughed out of the room, many times, and nobody was, would have been able to predict
50
this.
years ago. I don't know about 40 years ago.
Okay,
That's
50
already by the
years ago.
1980s, in which Chabad's infrastructure, think about the menorahs, the giant menorahs in December time. So I think the question is why, I guess, at the core is how, or why and how.
Yeah, and listen, maybe you've pinpointed it. I mean, there is the sort of famous debate that the Rebbe had with one of the heads of the Reform movement about putting up a public menorah, and the Reform movement's idea was, hey, we want separation of church and state. We don't want to bring religion into the public sphere. And the Rebbe essentially said, you know, almost like whatever, like everyone's doing this. There are crosses in public parks in America. Why not, compete in the public sphere? And so, that very much like we are going to do us regardless of how that's viewed by the public, So, I mean, maybe that's part of it. But I guess if you had to pinpoint what Chabad has done right, and then, sort of by extension for most, I assume most of the listeners to this podcast are not Chabad affiliated, or maybe they're, if they're congregants and students, they've gone to Chabad. But, for a lot of people who listen to this that are rabbis and Jewish professionals outside of Chabad, what might they learn from Chabad's success in the last 50 years?
Yeah. Number one is an embrace of simultaneously and maybe complementarily, and I'm just thinking out loud with you, is a high degree of what is, I'll use air quotes, authenticity, and also counterculture. Think about the college quad, which you know far better than I. In the 1960s, Yitz Greenberg and others were writing about is like the college campus is where the Jewish soul goes to die. And then in the 70s and the 80s, Hillel is really the hero. That actually, no, to the contrary, that path towards confirmation or B'nai Mitzvah was where the Jewish soul went to die. We're reinvigorating it when they come to college campus. And eventually in the 1990s, Birthright emerges as a huge engine to support the fostering of Jewish life on campus. And now, I think with very serious concerns over anti-Semitism, we are re-legislating that debate. But certainly with that very important exception, which again, you know far better than I, college campus, we as Jewish parents, as Jewish educators, we look forward to when college students would not college students, when Jewish teens would become college students and they would have access to Hillel, Pi, Chabad. What a magical Disneyland of a Jewish experience. Much has changed. That changed from the 60s to the 90s. Chabad did really well to anticipate all of this. And they did it through being welcoming. They did it also through that appearance, through that sense of this is what an authentic Jew must look like. And there's a certain authority structure of, and many people don't want do-it-yourself Judaism, right? A lot of MBA capstone projects have been based on the salesmanship of the Trader Joe's and the Costco's. We don't want 15 options of pizza sauce. We want one or two. We want to be told. We want options for all things, but there's only so much we can handle. To the contrary, Netflix wants you to get lost in the menagerie of options. They want you to struggle for 25 minutes about what to watch before you eventually select it, because that will keep you bought in for next month's subscription. That's a very different model. People generally they resent options. Do-it-yourself Judaism has a place. Chabad has, better than most, mastered do-it-yourself, come as you are, with this is how we do it.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to get at before when I was talking about the difference between inclusivity and pluralism. I think you said it better than I did in terms of, most people don't want to do it yourself. They want to show up to Shabbat and be told, and again, this, hurts me as sort of a educator, but be told, like, here is the right way to do Kiddush. You say exactly this, you do exactly this, here's who's allowed to make it, and everything there. I did in the last, 10 or 15 minutes, and then if you have anything else, feel free to steer us there, want to talk about Zionism in the American Jewish community. We can just spend like 2 or 3 minutes tracing the history because I think it's quite interesting. And then we can talk about, where our community is at now. So I'll give just like a 90-second summary. And if, any of it is incorrect, let me know. People are often surprised to hear that Zionism was very unpopular in the American Jewish community until about World War I. The Pittsburgh Platform, the sort of, document of American Reform Judaism. In 1885, famously wrote, Judaism is no longer a nation. We are a religion. We expect no return to Palestine or, a rebuilding of the temple or anything there. They then subsequently, as you said before, changed the prayer book.
Columbus Platform in 1930. Oh, yeah.
Change the prayer book again to reflect all of that. After World War I, a couple of things happened. There was an uptick in anti-Semitism in Europe, and also America closed its borders, which then started the sort of Zionistification of American Judaism. And then by the end of World War II, essentially, if you were not either on the, far left, Bundist socialist group, or, Satmar Chassid, you were essentially, within these, very wide bounds of American Judaism, you were a Zionist. That is starting to change. So talk to us a little bit about, Zionism over the last couple of generations and where you sort of see that playing out in Judaism from now on.
So the reforms indignation, which changes formally in the Columbus Platform of 1937, which they have an embrace of Zionism. In fact, both Michael Meyer and Jonathan Sarna have written about converts to Zionism within the reform movement that anticipated this. That was a very theological. debate over, can America be our Zion? And that goes all the way back to the early 19th century. Today's, I think, is a much more political, I think it objectively is a much more political discussion. And it really is about the fissures that center on our political, social, and religious values, or the lack thereof. Some people obviously see them totally in concert with another. And also think about your earlier question about the synagogue and what role it plays in American Jewish life. Since 1948, for many people, Israel has been their synagogue. AIPAC has been their temple. Or for other people, it's been J Street or whatever. Israel has been their Jewish center of gravity. What we've seen with Zionism, with anti-Semitism, sometimes combating anti-Semitism is your center of gravity, because of the politicization of it, which again, for us is very tender and very fraught and painful. Think about, I alluded to them before, in 1845, Baptists split between North and South, not because they disagreed with doctrine, but because they disagreed over slavery. We are seeing a fracturing of the American Jewish community that, again, with very different topics, slavery, Zionism. But we are seeing a fracturing on socio-political lines. And that's really, really painful. And for a lot of people whose headquarters of Judaism centered on Israel and Jewish safety, they are really struggling. We're all struggling, but they're struggling differently than maybe others.
This is going to be a very unfair question to you, so I'm going to preface it there. Given that Israel, and if you disagree with the premise or the question, you might not like any of it, but I'll try it anyway. Given that Israel is a huge part of just the modern day Jewish world, both in terms of obviously the history of what the land has meant, Jewish tradition, the fact that 50% of Jews live there, it seems very hard to believe that if you are a Jew in America, you are not particularly religious in terms of, you have little halachic observance or textual tradition, right? So I'm not talking about, Satmar and groups that are, anti-Zionist, but deeply religious. If you are just an American Jewish, not super religious, anti-Zionist, it seems very hard to imagine that there's something concrete that will allow that type of community to survive over the next, 30, 40, 50 years. Given that it's a Judaism that's not, based on anything, either land or text or practice, but just this vague sense of identity of, ephemeral Jewish values and Jewish identity. Do you agree with that assessment? I know you're not gonna like the question.
No. I think it's a question. It's something that no less than the chancellor, I don't think he was at the time, of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Gerson Cohn, great medieval Jewish historian, gave a much talked about lecture of the blessing of assimilation in Jewish history. His topic was Zionism, but his topic was writing and speaking and then publishing it in the late 60s around intermarriage and assimilation, the question of the survival of the Jewish people and how they are or not tethered to Jewish institutions. I remember, maybe it's good to sort of move our conversation to a close with him again, is first time I ever interacted intellectually with my beloved teacher, Jonathan Sarna, was not an actual interaction. Rabbi Norman Lamb had sat for an interview with the Jerusalem Post, somebody with whom I was close with at Yeshiva University. And there was a line that he offered about saying Kaddish for the conservative movement. It must have been the early 2000s. I've never told the story before. I don't even know if Jonathan knows about this. And Jonathan wrote a rebuttal, I believe in the Jerusalem Post. Not as a stakeholder in the debate, but as a historian who understands that American religion operates in cycles. And it's never smart or particularly wise to anticipate This is a criticism of Rabbi Lamb, per se. It's criticism of anybody who thinks linearly about these things. Um, when somebody is up in 10 years from now, 2 months from now, they may be down. And things move in cycles, ebbs and flows. It's hard for the historian to play for the role of prophet. They're very poor prophets, typically. Um, and I think, therefore, how those folks who have assigned so much of their Jewishness to Zionism and what the fallout is, it could be that they feel disenfranchised. It could be that folks who align themselves to the Republican or Democratic parties, who have changed significantly over the last 5 years, 10 years, 2 years, 2 months, how they feel disengaged. It's always going to be very curious, and there are so many different historical models for how do they just drop away, or do they find other paths toward meaning, or do they reinterpret situations to provide new meaning. I don't mean to be opaque, just that we are living, I've never, as a kid of the 80s and 90s, and obviously Berlin Wall, Whitewater, there are all sorts of huge moments in this time period, the 94 baseball strike. But we're living in such a strange time. My children are growing up in the polarization of American politics, the COVID pandemic, it's massive inflation. It's incredible. And so, of all the times in the world to think cyclically and rather than linearly, I think this is the moment. So it's not a, I hope it's not a cop out.
No, no,
I
it
just
totally
don't know.
isn't. And I was going to joke that, historians aren't good at playing prophets. Generally prophets sometimes aren't good at being prophets either. Zev Eleff, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.